The screams that pierced the cold December air at 4:30 in the morning would haunt Fayetteville, West Virginia, for the next 79 years. But it wasn't the screams themselves that made this Christmas Eve of 1945 so terrifying. It was the silence that followed, the silence of 5 children who simply vanished. George Sodder stood barefoot in the freezing snow, watching his 2-story home become a towering inferno against the star-filled sky. The flames danced like demons, consuming everything he had worked 20 years to build. But George wasn't thinking about his house, his furniture, or even his small trucking business. His mind was locked on one horrifying reality. 5 of his children were somewhere inside that blazing death trap. Betty, Jennie, Martha, Louis, Maurice. His voice cracked as he screamed their names into the roaring flames. The fire answered back with cruel indifference, sending sparks spiraling up toward the heavens like twisted prayer. His wife, Jennie, clutched their youngest daughter, Sylvia, against her chest while their eldest daughter, Marion, held tight to their other surviving children. The family that had been 10 strong just hours earlier was now split by an unthinkable tragedy. But as the first rays of Christmas morning sun began to creep across the charred landscape, George Sodder would discover that this was no ordinary house fire. This was the beginning of America's most haunting mystery. The Sodder family had settled into their evening routine on December 24, 1945. Just like any other night, George had returned home from his trucking route, tired but satisfied with the day's work. Maria had finished wrapping the last of the Christmas presents, carefully placing them under the modest tree they decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. Their children were buzzing with Christmas excitement. 17-year-old Marion helped her mother prepare for the next day's feast. 23-year-old John was already fast asleep, exhausted from his job helping his father with the trucking business. 16-year-old George Jr. played quietly in the living room, while 2-year-old Sylvia toddled around the warm house. But it was the 5 middle children who would soon become the center of an impossible puzzle. 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jennie, and 5-year-old Betty had been playing together all evening, their laughter filling the house with the pure joy that only children can create during Christmas time. Around 9:30 that night, something strange happened. A man appeared at their front door, someone George had never seen before. He was well-dressed, spoke with authority, and asked specific questions about George's trucks and his business. The stranger seemed particularly interested in George's recent criticism of Mussolini and his vocal opposition to fascist regimes. George had been outspoken about his political views, especially among the tight-knit Italian-American community in their area. "You should be more careful about the things you say, Mr. Sodder," the stranger had warned, his eyes cold and calculating. "People are listening, people who don't appreciate your opinion." George had dismissed the threat at the time, but now, standing in the snow watching his home burn, those words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. After the stranger left, the family continued their Christmas Eve tradition. Maria served hot cocoa while the children took turns reading from their favorite Christmas stories. By 10:30, most of the children had been sent to bed, though Betty and Jennie had been allowed to stay up a little later to help their mother with last-minute preparation. George remembered checking on the children around 11 o'clock. All 5 of the middle children were in their shared bedroom on the 2nd floor, nestled under thick quilts, whispering excitedly about Santa's arrival. Martha had asked him to leave their bedroom light on because she was afraid of the dark. Louis had shown him a small wooden toy soldier he'd made in school, proudly explaining how he planned to give it to Maurice for Christmas. "Papa," little Maurice had called out as George was leaving the room, "will Santa really come tonight?" "Of course he will, son," George had replied, gently ruffling the boy's dark hair. "He never misses a single child who's been good." Those were the last words George Bennett would ever speak to his 5 youngest children. The fire started sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning, though the exact time would become another piece of the puzzle that never quite fit. George and Maria were awakened not by smoke alarms, which didn't exist in 1945, but by the sound of breaking glass and the acrid smell of burning wood. George's first instinct was to run upstairs and gather his children, but when he reached the bottom of the staircase, He was met with a wall of flames. The fire had consumed the entire stairway, making it impossible to reach the second floor. The heat was so intense that his eyebrows were singed just from standing near the stairs. The ladder, Maria screamed. "George, get the ladder from the barn." George sprinted outside, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. But when he reached the spot where he always kept his extension ladder, it was gone, vanished. He searched frantically around the barn, in the tool shed, behind the house. The ladder that had been there just hours earlier had completely disappeared. Desperate, he ran to his truck, planning to drive it close to the house and somehow climb up to the second floor windows. But when he turned the key, nothing happened. The engine, which had run perfectly just hours before, was completely. He popped the hood and discovered that someone had cut through the electrical wires, deliberately disabling his vehicle. The nearest neighbor lived half a mile away. George ran through the snow in his bare feet, pounding on doors, screaming for help. But in those crucial minutes, while he was searching for a way to save his children, something impossible happened. The fire department, when they finally arrived, nearly 7 hours later, found something that defied all explanation. The second floor of the house had collapsed completely, but instead of finding the remains of 5 children in the ashes, they found nothing. No bones, no teeth, no personal belongings that could be identified as belonging to Betty, Jennie, Martha, Louis, or Maurice. Fire Chief William Morrison, a man with 20 years of experience, stood in the smoldering ruins, scratching his head. "George," he said slowly, "I have seen a lot of house fires in my time, but I have never seen anything like this." "What do you mean?" George asked, his voice hollow with grief and exhaustion. "A fire hot enough to completely incinerate human remains would have burned much longer, and much hotter than this," Morrison explained. "The wooden floor beams are barely charred. The metal bed frames upstairs are only slightly warped. But according to what you are telling me, 5 children were sleeping in that room when the fire started." Dr. Charles Martinez, the county coroner, arrived to examine the scene. After spending 6 hours sifting through the debris with a team of investigators, he made an announcement that would change everything. "I'm not finding any evidence that anyone perished in this fire," Dr. Martinez declared. "No bone fragments, no dental remains, no clothing fibers that would indicate human victims. If 5 children died in this blaze, there should be something left behind, but there's absolutely nothing." George felt a surge of hope mixed with terrible confusion. "Then where are they?" he asked. "If they didn't die in the fire, where are my children?" That question would launch an investigation that would span decades and involve everyone from local police to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But the more investigators dug into the events of that Christmas Eve, the more questions arose, and the fewer answers they found. The official investigation began with interviews of everyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that night. What they discovered was a series of strange events that seemed almost orchestrated. Mrs. Dorothy Palmer, who lived closest to the Bennett home, reported that she had seen a man parked on the road near the Bennett property around midnight. He was sitting in a large dark sedan, watching the house. When she looked again 20 minutes later, both the man and the car were gone. Johnny Walker, a local teenager who delivered newspapers, told police that he had seen a green pickup truck driving away from the Bennett farm around 1 in the morning. The truck was moving fast, and Johnny thought he saw what looked like several children in the back, though he couldn't be certain in the darkness. Most disturbing of all was the testimony of Martha Reynolds, the telephone operator who worked the night shift for the local phone company. She revealed that at approximately 12:45 in the morning, she had received a strange phone call. A man with a deep voice called asking to speak with George Bennett. Martha told investigators, "When I told him it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and that people were sleeping, he laughed. Not a normal laugh, but something cold and cruel. Then he said something I will never forget." "What did he say?" Detective Frank Morrison asked. Martha's voice trembled as she continued. "He said, 'Tell George Bennett that his children are going on a long trip. They won't be needing their Christmas presents this year.'" Then he hung up. The phone call had come 45 minutes before George and Maria were awakened by the fire. But the most chilling detail was that the Bennett's phone line had been cut sometime during the night. The call had never reached their home. As news of the missing children spread throughout the small community, more witnesses came forward with disturbing accounts. Sarah Chen, who ran the local general store, remembered the well-dressed stranger who had visited George on Christmas Eve. "He came into my store around noon that day," Sarah told police. "He asked specific questions about the Bennett family. He wanted to know how many children they had, what their ages were, and what time they usually went to bed. I thought it was strange, but he claimed to be a traveling salesman interested in selling toys." The stranger had paid particular attention when Sarah mentioned that the 5 middle children all slept in the same room. He had smiled when she said this, but Sarah remembered thinking it wasn't a pleasant smile. Even more troubling was the discovery that several people had seen unfamiliar vehicles in the area throughout the week leading up to Christmas Eve. Tom Rodriguez, a local farmer, reported seeing the same green pickup truck parked at different locations around town on 3 separate occasions. "Each time I saw it, there were 2 men inside," Tom explained. "They were always watching something or someone, but they would drive away whenever anyone got too close." Detective Morrison began to piece together a timeline that suggested the fire was not accidental, but rather a carefully planned event designed to cover up something far more sinister. The missing ladder, the disabled truck, the cut phone lines, and the mysterious vehicles all pointed to one terrifying conclusion: someone had deliberately orchestrated the removal of 5 children from their home. But why, and who would be capable of such an elaborate and heartless crime? The answer might have been found in George Sodder's background and his recent activities within the community. George had been born Giorgio Sodder in Tula, Sardinia in 1895, emigrating to America in 1908. When he was just 13 years old, he had settled in West Virginia to work in the coal mines before starting his own small trucking business. He was hard-working, honest, and well-respected by his neighbor. However, George had also been increasingly vocal about his political opinions, particularly his opposition to fascist movements in Europe. He had attended several meetings of Italian-American organizations, where he had spoken passionately against Mussolini's regime and criticized other Italian Americans who supported fascist ideology. Detective Morrison discovered that George had received several threatening phone calls in the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve. Callers had warned him to keep his mouth shut and suggested that bad things could happen to people who didn't know their place. George had dismissed these threats as the work of cranks and political extremists. He had never imagined that anyone would target his innocent children to silence his political voice. Dr. Rebecca Williams, a criminologist from the State University, was brought in to create a psychological profile of the perpetrators. Her analysis painted a disturbing picture of the kind of people who might be capable of orchestrating such a crime. "We are looking for individuals with significant organizational skills and resources," Dr. Williams explained to the investigation team. "The level of planning required to disable multiple escape routes, coordinate the timing of the fire, and successfully remove 5 children without detections suggests either professional criminals or individuals with military or intelligence training." She continued, "The symbolic timing of Christmas Eve is also significant. This wasn't random. The perpetrators wanted to send a message that was as psychologically devastating as possible. They wanted to destroy not just George Bennett's political voice, but his entire reason for living." The psychological profile suggested that the kidnappers were likely part of a larger organization, possibly with political motivations. They would have conducted surveillance on the Bennett family for weeks or even months before executing their plan. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Williams believed that the children were taken alive and that the fire was set specifically to destroy evidence and create confusion about what had actually happened. As winter turned to spring, and spring to summer, the official investigation began to slow down. Local police lacked the resources to pursue all the leads, and state investigators were pulled away to handle other cases. But George and Maria Bennett refused to give up hope. They hired private investigators, traveled to surrounding states, following up on reported sightings, and distributed thousands of flyers with their children's photographs. Maria kept the children's bedroom exactly as it had been on Christmas Eve, washing their clothes every week and setting out fresh flowers by their photographs. George became obsessed with finding answers. He began his own investigation, traveling to Italian-American communities throughout the region asking questions about political organizations and suspected fascist sympathizers. What he discovered was a network of individuals who had maintained strong ties to Mussolini's government even after Italy's defeat in World War II. Several people told George off the record that there had been whispered conversations about teaching him a lesson and showing him what happened to people who betrayed their heritage. But no one was willing to provide names or specific details that could lead to arrest. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened their own inquiry into the case in 1946, classifying it as a potential kidnapping with political motivation. Agent Robert Thompson, who led the FBI investigation, discovered evidence of organized criminal activity in the region, including a network that smuggled political refugees and war criminals out of Europe through various American ports. The Bennett case fits a pattern we have been tracking, Agent Thompson explained in his confidential report. Organized groups using intimidation and violence to silence political opposition within immigrant communities. The sophistication of this operation suggests professional involvement, but even the FBI's resources proved insufficient to crack the case. The perpetrators had covered their tracks too well, and too much time had passed before federal investigators became involved. As the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, George and Maria Bennett made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would never stop searching for their children, and they would never stop believing that Betty, Jennie, Martha, Louis, and Maurice were still alive somewhere. On Christmas Eve, 1946, exactly 1 year after the fire, Maria Bennett received a telephone call that would reignite hope and terror in equal measure. "Maria," a woman's voice whispered over the crackling phone line, "your children are alive. But if you ever want to see them again, you must stop asking questions. Stop talking to investigators. Pretend they died in the fire. And maybe, someday, they will come home." The line went dead before Maria could respond, leaving her trembling with a mixture of joy and fear that would consume her thoughts for the rest of her life. But the caller had made one crucial mistake. In her desperation to deliver the message quickly, she had revealed something that only someone directly involved in the disappearance would know, something that would eventually provide the key to unraveling this decades-long mystery. As part one of our investigation closes, the Bennett family stands at a crossroads between hope and despair, between accepting the unthinkable loss of their children and pursuing a truth that threatens to destroy everything they have left. The Christmas Eve fire of 1945 was not the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a journey into darkness that would span generations. 5 children vanished into the night, leaving behind only questions that grow more disturbing with each passing day. But somewhere in the shadows of this small West Virginia town, someone knows exactly what happened to Betty, Jennie, Martha, Louis, and Maurice Bennett. And that someone is about to discover that some secrets are too dangerous to keep forever. The anonymous phone call that Jennie Sodder received on Christmas Eve 1946 changed everything. But it wasn't the words themselves that sent ice through her veins. It was what the caller revealed without realizing it. Something that would crack this case wide open, if only the Sodders could figure out what it meant. "Your children are alive, but if you ever want to see them again, you must stop asking questions." Those words haunted Maria's dreams for weeks. But there was something else. Something the mysterious woman had said in her haste to deliver the message and hang up quickly. She had mentioned something that only someone directly involved in the disappearance would know. Something that had never been reported in any newspaper or shared with any investigator. She had called little Maurice by his nickname, Buster. Only the Sodder family called him that. Maurice had earned the nickname as a toddler when he would bust into every room, every conversation, every quiet moment with his boundless energy and curiosity. It was a family secret, a term of endearment that had never left their home. Detective Frank Morrison sat across from Jennie Sodder in her small kitchen, the morning light casting long shadows across the table. The coffee had grown cold as Jennie repeated the phone call word for word, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and terror. "You are absolutely certain," she said. "Buster?" Detective Morrison asked, scribbling notes in his weathered notebook. "I'm certain," Maria replied, her hands shaking as she reached for her coffee cup. She said, "Buster is safe, but you must stop looking for them." How could a stranger know that name? Detective Morrison had been investigating the Sodder case for over a year, and every lead had turned into a dead end. But this phone call was different. This was the first real evidence that someone with intimate knowledge of the family was involved in the children's disappearance. Maria, I need you to think carefully. In the weeks before the fire, did any strangers come to your home? Anyone who might have heard you or George call Maurice by his nickname? Jennie closed her eyes, trying to recall every visitor, every conversation. There was the insurance salesman who threatened George, but he was only here for a few minutes, and he stayed in the front room. There was also the man who asked about work, the one who went to the back of the house and talked about the fuse boxes. What about the children? Could one of them have mentioned the nickname to someone at school? Possibly, Maria admitted, but who would remember such a small detail after all this time, and why would they use it in a phone call meant to scare us into silence? Detective Morrison had a theory, but it was one that made his blood run cold. What if the caller wasn't a stranger at all? What if someone from within the community, someone the Sodders trusted, had been involved from the beginning? The investigation took a dramatic turn 3 weeks later, when Detective Morrison received an unexpected visitor at the Fayetteville police station. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, the elderly woman who ran the boarding house on Main Street, appeared at his desk with information that would shatter everything they thought they knew about the case. Detective Morrison, Miss Walsh began, her voice barely above a whisper. I have been carrying this burden for over a year, and I can't stay silent anymore. What burden, Mrs. Walsh? On Christmas Eve 1945, I had a guest at my boarding house, a man who checked in under the name Robert Collins. He paid cash for 3 nights, but he was gone by Christmas morning. Detective Morrison felt his pulse quicken. What made this guest unusual? He wasn't sleeping, Mrs. Walsh continued. I heard him pacing in his room all night, and around 2 in the morning, I heard him making telephone calls, multiple calls. He was speaking in a low voice, but I could hear bits of conversation through the thin walls. What did you hear? Mrs. Walsh pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her purse. I wrote down what I could understand. He said something about the packages are ready for delivery, and the fire will cover our tracks. But the thing that's haunted me most is what he said at the end of one call. She paused, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper. He said, tell them Buster and the others are safe, but they will never see home again unless the old man learns to keep his mouth shut about the homeland. Detective Morrison felt the room spin around him. This was the proof they needed. Someone had orchestrated the entire event, and they had intimate knowledge of the Bennett family. Mrs. Walsh, why didn't you come forward sooner? I was terrified, she admitted. The next morning, when I went to clean his room, I found something that made me understand how dangerous these people were. She reached into her purse again and pulled out a small dark object. Detective Morrison recognized it immediately. It was a pineapple hand grenade, the same type of incendiary device that George Bennett had suspected was thrown onto his roof. He left this behind, probably by accident. I have been too frightened to report it, but after hearing about the phone call Miss Bennett received, I knew I had to speak up. Within hours, Detective Morrison had assembled a task force to investigate this new lead. The description Mrs. Walsh provided of Robert Collins was circulated to law enforcement agencies throughout the region, but what they discovered was even more disturbing than they had imagined. Robert Collins was an alias, but the real identity of the mysterious guest was Vincent Torino, a known associate of organized crime families operating between New York and Pittsburgh. His specialty was making problems disappear, and his methods were both efficient and terrifying. Agent Robert Thompson from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived in Fayetteville 3 days later with a file on Vincent Torino that painted a picture of a man capable of orchestrating exactly the kind of operation that had befallen the Bennett family. Torino has been connected to at least 6 cases of witness intimidation over the past 5 years, Agent Thompson explained to Detective Morrison and George Bennett. His organization specializes in what they call family adjustment. They remove key family members to ensure the silence of their targets. George Bennett's face grew pale as the implications became clear. You are saying they took my children to force me to stop criticizing Mussolini and his support. That's exactly what we are saying, Agent Thompson confirmed. Your vocal opposition to fascist sympathizers in the Italian-American community made you a target, but instead of killing you, which would have created a martyr, they chose a method that would torture you for the rest of your life,
while sending a clear message to others. The investigation expanded rapidly as federal agents began tracking Vincent Torino's movements throughout 1940. What they uncovered was a sophisticated network of safe houses, communication systems and transportation routes designed to move people quickly and quietly across state lines. Dr. Rebecca Williams, the criminologist who had profiled the perpetrators, was brought back to analyze this new evidence. Her updated assessment was chilling in its precision. "We are dealing with an organization that has studied the Sodder family for months, possibly longer," Dr. Williams explained. "They knew the layout of the house, the family's routines, and even intimate details like Maurice's nickname. This suggests either extensive surveillance or inside information." "Inside information?" George asked, his voice tight with anger. "You mean someone we know was involved?" "It's possible," Dr. Williams admitted. "Think about who would have access to your home, who would have heard you call Maurice Buster, and who would have known enough about your family to plan such an elaborate operation." The thought that someone they trusted might have betrayed them sent Maria into a spiral of paranoia and suspicion. Every neighbor, every friend, every casual acquaintance became a potential supplicant in her mind. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Johnny Martinez, a local mechanic who had serviced George's trucks, approached Detective Morrison with information that would finally begin to unravel the conspiracy. "Detective, I have been thinking about that night for over a year," Johnny said. "George's trucks were sabotaged, but not in the way we originally thought." "What do you mean?" "Someone who knew those engines really well disabled them in a way that would look like flooding or mechanical failure. But when I examined them after the fire, I found something that didn't make sense."
Johnny pulled out a small metal component. "This is a fuel line fitting. It was loosened just enough to prevent the engines from starting, but tight enough that casual inspection wouldn't reveal the sabotage. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." "Could you determine when this was done?" "Based on the wear patterns, I'd say it happened within hours of the fire. Someone accessed those trucks very recently, before the incident." This revelation led to a disturbing realization. The saboteur had been on the Bennett property shortly before the fire, which meant they either had legitimate access or were skilled enough to avoid detection during a nighttime infiltration. Detective Morrison began interviewing everyone who had been on the Bennett property in the days leading up to Christmas Eve. The list was shorter than expected, but it included some surprising names. Father Michael Romano, the local priest who had visited to discuss Christmas services, had been there on December 23rd. Dr. Samuel Chen, the family physician who had checked on Maria's persistent cough, had visited on December 20th. And most surprisingly, Fire Chief William Morris himself had stopped by on December 21st to discuss fire safety measures for the upcoming holiday. Each of these men had legitimate reasons for their visits, but they also would have had opportunities to observe the family dynamics, learn about Maurice's nickname, and assess the property's vulnerability. The investigation took a dark turn when Agent Thompson discovered that Fire Chief Morris had received several large cash deposits in his bank account during the weeks following the fire. The amounts were significant enough to catch the attention of federal investigators tracking suspicious financial activity. When confronted with this evidence, Chief Morris initially denied any wrongdoing, but as the questioning intensified, his story began to change. "I was approached by someone who said they needed information about the Bennett property," Morris finally admitted. "They claimed to be insurance investigators looking into potential fire hazards. They offered me money for a detailed report on the house's layout and the family's routine." "Who approached you?" Detective Morrison demanded. "A man who said his name was Anthony Romano. He claimed to be Father Michael's cousin from Pittsburgh. He knew enough about local families to seem legitimate." The name Anthony Romano sent chills through the investigation team. According to FBI records, Anthony Romano was another known alias used by Vincent Torino when he needed to blend into Italian-American communities. But Chief Morris's confession revealed something even more disturbing. He had provided Torino with detailed floor plans of the Bennett house, information about the family's sleeping arrangements, and even a schedule of George's trucking routes. "I thought I was helping with a legitimate insurance investigation," Morris claimed. "I had no idea they were planning anything violent." "What about the beef liver you buried at the fire scene?" Agent Thompson asked. "Was that part of their plan too?" Maurice's face crumpled as he realized the full scope of his involvement. Romano told me that if no remains were found, it would raise too many questions. He gave me the liver and told me to plant it so the family would have closure and stop investigating. The revelation that the local fire chief had been compromised explained many of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the fire. The delayed response time, the cursory search of the ruins, and the immediate conclusion that the children had died in the blaze, all made sense if Maurice was working to cover up evidence of kidnapping. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Father Michael Romano, when questioned about his supposed cousin Anthony, revealed that he had never heard of anyone by that name in his family. "Someone used my name to gain credibility," Father Romano explained. "This Anthony Romano, whoever he really was impersonating a member of my family to infiltrate our community." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Torino had spent months embedding himself in the Fayetteville community, using false identities and exploiting trust relationships to gather intelligence on the Sodder family. Samuel Chen, when questioned, revealed that during his visit to treat Maria's cough, a man claiming to be a medical equipment salesman had been present. The man had asked detailed questions about the family's health, sleeping patterns, and even which bedrooms the children used. "I thought it was odd at the time," Dr. Chen admitted. "But he seemed professional, and he had legitimate business cards and equipment samples." The description Dr. Chen provided matched Vincent Torino perfectly. The criminal had been bold enough to enter the Bennett home during a medical visit, gathering intelligence while hiding in plain sight. As 1947 progressed, the investigation had identified most of the key players in the conspiracy, but the children remained missing. The trail of Vincent Torino and his associates had gone cold, and federal agents were beginning to suspect that the children had been moved far from West Virginia. Agent Thompson received a breakthrough in July 1947, when a contact in the New York Police Department reported suspicious activity at a warehouse in Brooklyn. The facility was owned by a company with ties to known organized crime figures, and neighbors had reported seeing children being moved in and out of the building at unusual hours. A surveillance operation was mounted, but it yielded frustrating results. The warehouse appeared to be used for legitimate storage during the day, but there were clear signs of other activities occurring at night. One evening in August, surveillance agents observed a black sedan arrive at the warehouse after midnight. Two men exited the vehicle and spent approximately 30 minutes inside the building before departing. License plate tracking revealed that the car was registered to a shell company linked to Vincent Torino's criminal network. Federal agents obtained a warrant to search the warehouse, but when they arrived, they found it completely empty except for a few pieces of abandoned furniture and some children's clothing that appeared to have been left behind deliberately. Forensic examination of the clothing revealed that it belonged to children matching the ages of the missing Sodder children, but DNA testing was not yet available to confirm their identities. However, one piece of evidence sent chills through the investigation. Sewn into the collar of a small dress was a handmade label that read Betty S. Jennie Sodder confirmed that she had sewn identical labels into all of her daughter's clothing to help identify them at school. The children had been in that warehouse, but they were gone by the time federal agents arrived. Someone had warned the kidnappers that law enforcement was closing in. The investigation faced a devastating setback when it was discovered that information about the planned raid had been leaked to the criminal network. A corrupt federal agent, later identified as Agent Michael Russo, had been feeding intelligence to Vincent Torino's organization in exchange for substantial cash payments. Agent Russo's betrayal had allowed the kidnappers to stay one step ahead of law enforcement throughout the investigation. Every time federal agents thought they were close to rescuing the children, the criminals had already moved them to a new location. The discovery of Agent Russo's corruption led to a complete overhaul of the investigation. All previous intelligence was assumed to be compromised, and a new team was assembled with the highest security clearances. But by then, it was too late. The children had vanished into a network of safe houses and secret locations that spanned multiple states. The trail had gone completely cold, and the Sodder family was left with nothing but questions and the fading hope that their children might still be alive somewhere. As part 2 of our investigation closes, the conspiracy behind the Sodder children's disappearance has been partially exposed. but the children themselves remain lost in a labyrinth of organized crime and corruption that reaches into the highest levels of law enforcement. The anonymous phone call that promised Jennie her children were alive has proven to be both a blessing and a curse. It revealed the scope of the conspiracy, but also demonstrated how powerful and well-connected their enemies truly were. 5 children taken in the night, victims of a plot that used their innocent lives as weapons against their father's political beliefs. The investigation has revealed the who and the why, but the where remains an agonizing mystery. Somewhere in America, Betty, Jennie, Martha, Louis, and Maurice Sodder may still be alive, growing up in captivity, unaware that an entire nation is searching for them, or they may have been silenced forever by criminals who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to their political agenda. As we prepare for part 3 of this haunting tale, the Sodder family stands at a crossroads between justice and despair, between hope and the terrible possibility that some secrets are buried too deep to ever uncover. The shadows of truth have begun to emerge, but the light of resolution remains frustratingly out of reach in this case that has consumed the lives of everyone it has touched. But the investigation was far from over. As autumn turned to winter in 1947, a series of disturbing discoveries would push this case into even darker territory, revealing that the conspiracy was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Patricia Lawson, a psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins University who specialized in trauma and memory, was brought in to interview the surviving Sodder children. What she discovered during her sessions with Marion, John, George Jr., and little Sylvia would add another layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. The children are exhibiting classic signs of suppressed trauma, Dr. Lawson explained to Agent Thompson and Detective Maurice. But it's not just trauma from the fire itself. There are indicators that suggest they witnessed something before the fire that they have been unconsciously blocking from their memories. During her session with 17-year-old Marion, Lawson used hypnotic regression techniques to help the girl access memories from Christmas Eve that had been buried by psychological shock. What emerged was a revelation that changed everything the investigators thought they knew about that night. "I remember now," Marion whispered, her voice barely audible as she remained in the hypnotic state. "Before the fire started, before Mama woke up, I heard voices outside. Men talking in low voices near the back of the house." "What were they saying?" Dr. Lawson asked gently. "One of them said, 'Make sure you get all 5 of them out before we light it up.' Another voice, someone with an accent, said, 'The old man needs to learn that his big mouth has consequences.'" The room fell silent as the implications became clear. The children hadn't died in the fire because they had never been in the house when it started. They had been taken beforehand, exactly as the conspiracy suggested. But Marion's recovered memories contained an even more chilling detail. "I saw a face," she continued under hypnosis, "a man looking through my bedroom window just before I fell asleep on the couch. He was watching us, counting us. When our eyes met, he put his finger to his lips and shook his head, like he was warning me to stay quiet." George Jr.'s session revealed similar suppressed memories. Under Dr. Lawson's careful guidance, the 16-year-old remembered hearing footsteps on the roof around midnight, followed by what sounded like someone cutting through wood or metal. They were on the roof for at least 20 minutes. George Jr. recalled, "I thought it was Santa Claus at first, but then I heard them talking about preparation and making sure the evidence burns completely." Most disturbing of all was little Sylvia's session. Despite being only 2 years old at the time of the fire, the child's memories contained details that should have been impossible for someone her age to retain or understand. "The bad men came before the fire," Sylvia said in her small voice. "They told my brothers and sisters to come with them, because the house was going to be dangerous. They said Mama and Papa sent them to keep them safe." Dr. Lawson's analysis painted a picture of a crime that was even more calculated and cruel than anyone had suspected. The kidnappers hadn't simply taken advantage of a house fire to cover their tracks. They had orchestrated the entire event, using the children's trust and the confusion of emergency situation to remove them from their home, without resistance. The psychological manipulation involved here is extremely sophisticated, Dr. Lawson explained. These criminals didn't just kidnap 5 children. They convinced the children to cooperate in their own abduction by presenting themselves as rescuers. Agent Thompson felt sick as he contemplated the implications. "You are saying the children went willingly with their kidnappers?" "Initially, yes,
Dr. Lawson confirmed. By the time they realized they weren't being taken to safety, they were already far from home, and completely under the control of their captors. A breakthrough in understanding how the kidnapping was executed led to a renewed focus on tracking Vincent Torino's network. Agent Thompson assembled a team of investigators to map out every known associate, safe house and transportation route used by the criminal organization. What they discovered was a network that operated across 12 states, with connections reaching into Canada and Mexico. The organization specialized in making people disappear, whether permanently or temporarily, depending on the needs of their clients. But the most shocking discovery came when federal agents raided an abandoned farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania in December 1940. Hidden in a secret compartment beneath the floorboards, they found documents that detailed the entire Sodder operation. The papers, written in Vincent Torino's distinctive handwriting, revealed that the kidnapping had been commissioned by a group calling itself the Homeland Protection Society. This organization was composed of Italian-American business leaders who viewed George Sodder's anti-fascist statements as a threat to their community's reputation and their business interests. According to the documents, the society had paid Torino $50,000 to permanently silence George Sodder's political voice. The kidnapping of his children was specifically chosen as a method that would destroy him psychologically while sending a clear message to other potential critics. But the most horrifying detail in the documents was a timeline that showed the operation had been planned for over 8 months. The criminals had conducted extensive surveillance on the Sodder family, documenting their routines, mapping their relationships, and identifying the optimal time and method for the abduction. The papers included detailed floor plans of the Sodder house, schedules of George's trucking routes, and even personal information about each child's personality and fears. The kidnappers had known exactly how to manipulate each child into cooperation. 5-year-old Betty's file noted that she was afraid of the dark and could be calmed by being told stories about princesses. 8-year-old Jennie's profile indicated that she was naturally trusting and would follow anyone who claimed to be helping her family. 9-year-old Louis was described as protective of his younger siblings and would cooperate to ensure their safety. 12-year-old Martha's file revealed that she was the natural leader among the children and would need to be convinced that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. 14-year-old Maurice was identified as the biggest potential problem because of his size and independence, requiring additional measures to ensure compliance. Reading these clinical assessments of innocent children being targeted for psychological manipulation made even experienced investigators struggle to maintain their composure. Agent Thompson discovered that the Homeland Protection Society had ties to several legitimate businesses in the Italian-American community, including restaurants, construction companies, and import firms. Many of these businesses had been suffering financially due to anti-Italian sentiment in the aftermath of World War II, and they blamed outspoken critics like George Sodder for drawing negative attention to their community. The society's membership included respected community leaders, successful businessmen, and even some local politicians. They had convinced themselves that silencing George Sodder was a patriotic act that would protect the reputation and economic interests of Italian Americans throughout the region. But the documents also revealed something that gave Agent Thompson hope. The original plan had called for the permanent elimination of the Sodder children after a period of psychological torture, designed to break George's spirit. However, several members of the society had objected to harming innocent children, leading to a compromise. Instead of killing the children, they would be placed in a network of Catholic orphanages and foster homes throughout the country, given new identities, and raised to believe their original family had died in the fire. This would allow the society to maintain leverage over George, while avoiding the moral burden of child murder. The documents included a list of potential placement locations, stretching from California to Florida. Each facility was run by sympathetic priests, or administrators who could be trusted to maintain the secret and ensure the children never learned their true identity. Agent Thompson realized that if this information was accurate, the Sodder children might still be alive, growing up in institutions across America under assumed names. The challenge would be identifying which facilities had been used and locating children who might not even remember their real names or family. The federal investigation expanded dramatically as agents began visiting Catholic orphanages and foster care facilities throughout the target state. They carried photographs of the missing children and asked administrators to review their records for any new arrivals in late 1945 or early 1940. The process was painstakingly slow and often met with resistance from religious officials who cited confidentiality concerns. Many institutions refused to cooperate without court orders, and obtaining warrants required presenting evidence to judges who were often skeptical of such an elaborate conspiracy theory. But in February 1948, Agent Thompson received a call that sent electricity through the entire investigation team. Sister Margaret O'Malley from St. Catherine's Home for Children in Sacramento, California, had contacted the FBI with information that could break the case wide open. "We had 5 children arrive here in January 1946. Sister Margaret explained over the long-distance phone call. "They were brought by a man who claimed to be a relative, but there was something strange about the whole situation." "What made it strange?" Agent Thompson asked, his pulse racing. "The children seemed traumatized, but not in the way you'd expect from orphans. They kept asking about their real parents and insisting they had been taken from their home. The man who brought them had documentation showing their parents had died in a house fire, but the children refused to believe it." Agent Thompson could barely contain his excitement. "Sister, I need you to describe these children for me." "There were 3 girls and 2 boys. Sister Margaret continued. "The oldest was a boy around 14, very protective of the others. There were 2 girls who looked like sisters, maybe 8 and 12 years old. The youngest girl was only about 5, and there was another boy around 9 who rarely spoke." The description matched the missing Sodder children perfectly. Agent Thompson immediately arranged for a team of federal agents to travel to Sacramento with photographs and medical records that could confirm the children's identities. But when the agents arrived at St. Catherine's Home 3 days later, they were met with devastating news. The 5 children had been transferred to another facility just weeks after arriving. Sister Margaret produced transfer documents showing they had been moved to Sacred Heart Children's Home in Phoenix, Arizona. The agents rushed to Phoenix, only to discover that the children had been transferred again, this time to St. Joseph's Orphanage in New Orleans. The pattern continued as investigators followed a trail of transfers that led them across the country, always arriving just weeks or months after the children had been moved to yet another location. It became clear that the criminal network was still operating, moving the children regularly to stay ahead of the investigation. Someone was monitoring federal law enforcement activities and alerting the conspirators whenever investigators got too close. The realization that the network had infiltrated federal law enforcement at multiple levels was both terrifying and infuriating. Agent Thompson began to suspect that the corruption extended far beyond the single rogue agent they had already identified. As the investigation continued into the spring of 1948, the psychological toll on the Sodder family became increasingly apparent. George had developed a drinking problem and was neglecting his trucking business. Jennie barely slept, spending her nights staring out the window and jumping at every sound. The surviving children were struggling with survivor's guilt and the constant uncertainty about their siblings' fate. Marion had quit her job and rarely left the house. John had enlisted in the military, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of grief and suspicion that pervaded their home. Dr. Lawson continued to work with the family, helping them process their trauma while also extracting additional memories that might aid the investigation. During one particularly intense session with George Sodder himself, she uncovered a memory that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. Under hypnosis, George recalled a conversation he had overheard at a local Italian-American social club several weeks before the fire. 2 men he didn't recognize had been discussing the problem with Sodder, and how he needed to be taught a lesson that would keep his mouth shut permanently. One of them mentioned a contact in Pittsburgh who specialized in family problems, George remembered. They said this person had handled similar situations for other communities that needed to maintain unity and protect their interests. This memory provided Agent Thompson with a new lead to pursue. The Pittsburgh connection suggested that the conspiracy extended beyond the local Italian-American community in West Virginia. There might be a larger network of organizations using similar tactics to silence political dissent within ethnic communities across the country. Federal investigators began examining unsolved missing persons cases in other cities with large Italian-American populations. What they discovered was a pattern of mysterious disappearances involving people who had been vocal critics of fascist sympathizers or organized crime infiltration within their communities. The Sodder case was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign of intimidation and terror designed to maintain silence and compliance within immigrant communities that were struggling to assimilate into American society while dealing with suspicion and discrimination from the broader population. As 1948 drew to a close, the investigation had revealed the existence of a vast criminal network that operated with near impunity across multiple states. The conspiracy involved corrupt law enforcement officials, compromised religious institutions, and a web of legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal activity. But despite all the evidence that had been uncovered, despite the documents that proved the children had been kidnapped rather than killed, despite the testimony of witnesses who had seen them alive, the 5 Sodder children remained missing. Somewhere in America, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie and Betty were growing up under false names, possibly unaware of their true identities, while their families suffered through each day not knowing if they were alive or dead. The investigation had revealed the how and the why of their disappearance, but the where remained an agonizing mystery that would continue to torment the Sodder family for decades to come. Agent Thompson refused to give up, but he was beginning to understand that they were fighting an enemy with resources and connections that far exceeded anything he had encountered in his federal law enforcement career. The conspiracy that had taken the Sodder children was just the tip of an iceberg that extended deep into the corruption and criminality that plagued post-war America. As part 2 of our investigation draws to its extended conclusion, the Sodder family finds themselves caught in a nightmare that has no clear end. The truth about their children's fate has been partially revealed, but that truth has only led to more questions, more suspects, and more reasons to fear that justice may never be served. 5 innocent children, taken from their beds on Christmas Eve, have become pawns in a game of political intimidation and organized crime that reaches into the highest levels of American society. Their disappearance has exposed a network of corruption that threatens the very foundations of law and order in post-war America. The investigation continues, but the shadows grow deeper with each revelation, and the hope of ever bringing the Sodder children home alive grows dimmer with each passing day. 23 years had passed since that terrible Christmas Eve when 5 children vanished into the night. George Sodder was now 73 years old, his hair completely white, his once strong frame bent by decades of grief and relentless searching. Jennie Sodder had worn black every single day since 1945, her eyes still scanning every crowd, every street corner, hoping for a glimpse of a face that might belong to one of her lost children. The investigation had officially been closed by federal authorities in 1952, deemed unsolvable due to lack of concrete evidence and the passage of time, but the Sodder family had never stopped searching. Their billboards still stood along Route 16, weathered but defiant, showing the faces of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie and Betty, along with the haunting question, what happened to these children? Detective Frank Morrison, now retired but still haunted by the case that had defined his career, sat in his small apartment in Fayetteville surrounded by boxes of files, photographs and evidence that he had refused to turn over to the authorities. At 68 years old, he knew he was running out of time to solve the mystery that had consumed the last 23 years of his life. On this cold February morning in 1968, Morrison received a phone call that would change everything.
Detective Morrison? This is Father Thomas McKenna from St. Anthony's Seminary in Baltimore. I believe I have information about the Sodder children that you need to hear. Morrison's hand trembled as he gripped the phone. Over the years, he had received hundreds of similar calls, each one raising hope only to lead to another dead end. But something in Father McKenna's voice was different. There was a gravity, a certainty that made Morrison's pulse quicken. Father, I'm listening. Detective, I'm calling because one of our seminary students, a young man named Michael Romano, is graduating this spring and will soon be ordained as a priest. But before he takes his final vows, he's come to me with a confession that has been weighing on his conscience for over 2 decades. Morrison felt the room spinning around him. What kind of confession? Michael Romano is not his real name, Detective. His real name is Maurice Sodder. The phone slipped from Morrison's hand, clattering onto the floor. After 23 years of searching, one of the missing children had found them. Within hours, Detective Morrison was on a train to Baltimore, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. What would he find? How much did Maurice remember? And most importantly, where were his 4 siblings? Father McKenna met Morrison at St. Anthony's Seminary, the imposing Gothic structure that seemed to rise from the earth, like a fortress of stone and prayer. The priest was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, and Morrison could see the weight of the secret he had been carrying. "Detective Morrison, before you meet Michael, I need to prepare you for what you are going to hear. His story is one of the most heartbreaking and disturbing accounts I have encountered in 30 years of ministry." They walked through the seminary's quiet halls, past stained glass windows that cast colorful shadows on the polished floor. Morrison's footsteps echoed like gunshots in the silence, each step bringing him closer to answers he had sought for over 2 decades. "Michael has been with us for 4 years," Father McKenna explained. "He came to us as a troubled young man seeking meaning and purpose after what he described as a difficult childhood. It wasn't until he began preparing for ordination that he felt compelled to reveal his true identity and the circumstances that brought him here." They stopped outside a small office door. Through the frosted glass, Morrison could see the silhouette of a man sitting alone. "Detective, I must warn you, Michael's memories of his early childhood are fragmented, and what he does remember is deeply traumatic. But what he can tell you about his siblings, well, you will need to prepare yourself for the worst." Father McKenna opened the door, and Morrison found himself face to face with Maurice Sodder for the first time in 23 years. The young man who stood before him was tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that held depths of sadness that no 27-year-old should possess. But despite the years and the trauma, Morrison could still see traces of the 14-year-old boy who had vanished on Christmas Eve 1945. "Detective Morrison," Maurice said quietly, extending his hand, "I have been waiting a long time to talk to someone who knew my family." For several minutes, neither man could speak. Morrison stared at the face he had memorized from countless photographs, while Maurice studied the detective who had spent over 2 decades searching for him. Finally, Maurice broke the silence. "I remember you, detective. You came to our house after the fire. You were the one who believed my parents when they said we hadn't died in the flames." Morrison's voice cracked as he replied, "Maurice, your parents never stopped looking for you. Your mother still sets 5 extra places at the dinner table every Christmas Eve, hoping you and your siblings will come home." Tears streamed down Maurice's face as he absorbed this information. "Detective, I need to tell you what happened to us, all of it. But I'm warning you now, what I have to say is going to be very difficult to hear." They sat down in Father McKenna's office, and Maurice began to tell a story that was more horrifying than anything Morrison had imagined during his 23 years of investigation. "They came for us around midnight on Christmas Eve," Maurice began, his voice steady but his hands shaking. 5 men entered our house through the back door. They told us there was going to be a fire, and that our parents had sent them to take us somewhere safe. Morrison leaned forward, hanging on every word. "We believed them at first. They knew our names, our nicknames. They knew things about our family that strangers shouldn't have known. When little Betty started to cry, one of them called her by the pet name only our mother used. We thought they really were there to help us." Maurice paused, struggling to continue. "They took us to a car that was waiting in the woods behind our house. As we drove away, we could see the flames starting to consume our home. That's when we realized we weren't being rescued. We were being kidnapped." The next part of Maurice's story painted a picture of systematic psychological torture designed to break the children's spirits and erase their identities. "They kept us in a basement for several weeks, somewhere that smelled like coal and dampness. Each day, they would tell us that our parents were dead, that we had no family left, that no one was looking for us. They showed us newspaper articles about the fire, about how our bodies had been found in the room." Morrison felt sick as he listened to the deliberate psychological manipulation of innocent children. "They had different plans for each of us." Maurice continued. "The older children, Martha and myself, were considered too dangerous because we might remember too much. The younger ones, Louis, Jennie and Betty, were more valuable because they could be molded into new identities." "What happened to your siblings, Maurice?" Maurice closed his eyes, and Morrison could see him gathering the strength to reveal the most painful part of his story. "After about a month, they separated us. I was sent to a reform school in Pennsylvania, where I was given a new name, and told that I was an orphan whose family had died in a car accident. They beat me whenever I mentioned my real family or tried to tell anyone who I really was." He paused, his breathing becoming labored. "Martha was sent to a convent in Ohio. The last time I saw her, she was 12 years old, and still insisting that our parents were alive and looking for her. The nuns were told she was mentally unstable and needed to be kept in isolation until she accepted her new identity. Morrison felt his heart breaking as Maurice continued. Little Louis was adopted by a family in California. They were told he was an orphan whose parents had died in a house fire. The adoptive family was good to him, but they had no idea he had been kidnapped. As far as I know, he grew up believing he was their natural son. And Jennie and Betty? Maurice's voice became barely a whisper. 8-year-old Jennie was placed with a foster family in Florida. She was so young that they thought she would forget her real family completely. But Betty, 5-year-old Betty. He couldn't finish the sentence. Father McKenna placed a comforting hand on Maurice's shoulder, as the young man struggled with memories too painful to voice. "Take your time, son," the priest said gently. After several minutes, Maurice found the strength to continue. Betty was the youngest, and they thought she would be the easiest to place. But she never stopped crying for our mother. She never stopped asking when she could go home. After 6 months, the criminals decided she was too much of a risk. Morrison felt ice forming in his stomach. What did they do to her? They told me later when I was older, that Betty had died of pneumonia while in their care. But I think they killed her because she wouldn't forget who she really was. The office fell silent except for the sound of 3 grown men crying for a 5-year-old girl whose only crime had been loving her family too much to forget them. After several minutes, Detective Morrison found his voice. "Maurice, do you know where your other siblings are now?" "I have been searching for them for 10 years, Maurice replied. "That's part of why I entered the seminary. The Catholic Church has connections everywhere, and I hoped I could use those resources to find Martha Lewis and Jen. Have you found any trace of them?" Maurice reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. "Last year I received this letter from a woman in California. She said she had read about the Sodder case in a magazine, and thought her adopted brother might be one of the missing children." Morrison's hands shook as he read the letter. It was from Miss Sarah Mitchell of San Diego, California, who described her adopted brother Louis Mitchell, now 24 years old, who had always insisted he had dreams about a large family and a house fire, despite being told repeatedly that his birth parents had died when he was very young. Miss Mitchell included a photograph, Maurice said, handing Morrison a black and white picture. Morrison stared at the photograph of a young man in a Navy uniform. Despite the years and the military bearing, he could clearly see the resemblance to the 9-year-old Louis Sodder who had vanished in 1945. "Have you contacted him?" Morrison asked. "I wrote to him 6 months ago, but I haven't received a response. I think he's afraid to face the truth about his past. Living a lie is sometimes easier than confronting a painful reality." Maurice pulled out another document. "I have also been working with a private investigator to trace Martha. We think we have found her." The investigator's report indicated that a woman named Sister Mary Catherine, at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Cincinnati, Ohio, matched the age and physical description of Martha Sodder. The woman had entered the convent at age 18, and had taken a vow of silence that she had maintained for 13 years. The Mother Superior told my investigator that Sister Mary Catherine had arrived at the convent as a deeply troubled young woman, who claimed to have memories of a family she insisted was still alive. The nuns had been told she was suffering from delusions caused by childhood trauma. And Jennie. Maurice's face darkened. "Jennie is the one I'm most worried about. The trail goes cold in Florida when she was 16. The foster family reported that she had run away, but there were never any attempts to find her. I think she may have discovered the truth about her kidnapping and tried to come home." The implications of Jennie's disappearance hung heavy in the air. If she had learned her true identity and attempted to contact her family, the criminals responsible for the original kidnapping might have taken steps to silence her permanently. Detective Morrison realized that after 23 years of searching he was finally close to solving the Sodder case. But the solution was more heartbreaking than he had ever imagined. "Maurice, we need to contact your parents immediately. They deserve to know that you are alive." Maurice shook his head sadly. "Detective, I have been watching my family from a distance for years. I know about my father's drinking, my mother's depression, the way this tragedy has destroyed their lives. I'm not sure they could handle learning that their children are alive, but have been suffering for over 2 decades. They have a right to know," Morrison insisted. "Do they have a right to know that their 5-year-old daughter was probably murdered by the same criminals who took us? Do they have a right to know that Martha has been living in a convent,
refusing to speak because she's been told for 13 years that her memories of her family are delusions. Do they have a right to know that Jennie may be dead because she tried to come home? Morrison struggled with the ethical implications of Maurice's questions. Would the truth provide closure for George and Jennie Sodder, or would it destroy what little peace they had managed to find? But the decision was taken out of their hands 3 days later, when Detective Morrison received an urgent phone call from Fayetteville. "Detective Morrison, this is Sheriff Williams. You need to get back here immediately. George Sodder collapsed at his trucking yard this morning. He's in the hospital and the doctors say it's his heart. They don't think he has much time left." Morrison rushed back to West Virginia, bringing Maurice with him. The young man had finally agreed that his father deserved to know the truth before he died, regardless of how painful that truth might be. They arrived at Fayetteville General Hospital on a gray February afternoon. Jennie Sodder was sitting beside her husband's bed, holding his hand and whispering prayers. At 71 years old, she looked fragile and worn, but her eyes still held the fierce determination that had driven her to search for her children for over 2 decades. When she looked up and saw Maurice standing in the doorway, she knew immediately who he was. Despite the years, despite the growth from boy to man, a mother's recognition is absolute and instant. "Maurice?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hello, Mama," Maurice replied, tears streaming down his face. The reunion between mother and son was both joyful and heartbreaking. 23 years of separation, of wondering and hoping and grieving, collapsed into a single moment of recognition and love. George Sodder opened his eyes as his wife's crying grew louder. When he saw his eldest son standing beside his hospital bed, the old man's face lit up with a joy that seemed to restore years of life to his failing body. "My boy," George whispered, "my boy has come home." For the next hour, Maurice told his parents everything he had told Detective Morrison. He spoke gently but honestly about what had happened to their children, about the years of separation and suffering, about his search for his sibling. When he finished, George Sodder was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Maurice, I want you to know that I never stopped believing you were alive. Your mother and I, we knew in our hearts that our children hadn't died in that fire. But knowing you have been suffering all these years because of my big mouth, because I couldn't keep quiet about things that didn't matter. Papa, this wasn't your fault," Maurice interrupted. "You were standing up for what you believed was right. The men who took us, they were criminals and cowards. You were never responsible for their actions." George smiled weakly. "You have grown into a good man, son. I'm proud of you." Over the next few days, as George's condition slowly improved, the family began the difficult process of deciding what to do with the information Maurice had provided. Detective Morrison, working with FBI agent Thompson, who had remained involved in the case, began the process of officially identifying and locating the surviving Sodder children. Contact was made with Louis Mitchell in San Diego. After initial hesitation, the young Navy officer agreed to undergo DNA testing that would conclusively prove his identity. The results confirmed what everyone already knew. Louis Mitchell was indeed Louis Sodder. The reunion between Louis and his family was emotional but complicated. He had lived his entire adult life believing he was Louis Mitchell, and learning that his entire identity was based on a lie was profoundly disorienting. "I always had dreams about a big family," Louis told his parents during their first phone conversation in 23 years. "But my adoptive parents told me they were just fantasies, that I was making up stories about brothers and sisters who never existed." Sister Mary Catherine at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Cincinnati initially refused to meet with investigators, but when she learned that Maurice and Louis had been found, she finally agreed to see her family. The reunion with Martha was the most difficult. 13 years of enforced silence and psychological manipulation had left deep scars. She recognized her family immediately, but she struggled to accept that her memories had been real all along. "They told me I was crazy," Martha whispered to her mother during their first meeting. "They said my family was dead, that my memories were hallucinations caused by trauma. I started to believe them." "You were never crazy, sweetheart," Jennie replied, holding her daughter tight. "You were just a little girl who missed her family." But the search for 8-year-old Jennie remained fruitless. Despite extensive investigations by both federal agents and private investigators, no trace of her could be found after her disappearance from the Florida foster home in 1959. The family had to accept the painful possibility that Jennie Sodder might never be found, that she had either died during her attempt to return home, or had succeeded in creating a new identity so completely that even professional investigators couldn't locate her. As for 5-year-old Betty, Maurice's worst fears were confirmed. FBI investigators, working with the information he had provided, located the site where she had been buried in 1946. Her remains were returned to her family for proper burial, 22 years after her death. The criminal network responsible for the kidnapping had largely disbanded by the time the surviving children were found. Vincent Torino had died in prison in 1958 while serving time for unrelated charges. Most of his associates were either dead or had disappeared into new identities. The Homeland Protection Society had dissolved in the early 1950s as its members either died or moved away from the area. A few elderly suspects were interviewed by federal agents, but none were ever formally charged due to the difficulty of prosecuting crimes that were over 2 decades old. In the end, the Sodder case was officially closed, not with arrests and trials but with the bittersweet reunion of a family torn apart by greed, prejudice and political extremism. George Sodder lived for 6 more years after Maurice's return, long enough to see 3 of his children come home and to finally learn the truth about what had happened on that terrible Christmas Eve. He died in 1974, surrounded by his wife and the children who had survived their ordeal. Jennie Sodder continued to hope for Jennie's return until her own death in 1989. She never stopped wearing black, never stopped setting an extra place at the dinner table, never stopped believing that somewhere in America, her youngest daughter was still alive and might find her way home. Maurice Sodder was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1968 and spent his life working with missing children and traumatized families. He never married, dedicating his existence to helping other families avoid the suffering his own had endured. Louis Sodder returned to his adoptive family in California after visiting with his birth family. He maintained relationships with both families, though he struggled for years with issues of identity and belonging. He eventually became a successful engineer and had a family of his own. Martha Sodder left the convent in 1970 and slowly rebuilt her life with the help of intensive therapy and the support of her reunited family. She never fully recovered from the psychological damage inflicted during her 13 years of enforced silence, but she found peace in knowing that her memories had been real. The billboard that had stood along Route 16 for over 30 years was finally taken down in 1989 after Jennie Sodder's death, but the memory of the 5 children who vanished on Christmas Eve 1945 lives on as a reminder of the resilience of family love and the terrible cost of hatred and extremism. Today, 79 years after that terrible night, the Sodder case remains one of America's most haunting mysteries, not because it was never solved, but because the solution revealed truths about human cruelty and criminal corruption that were almost too terrible to believe. 3 children came home. 1 child's remains were recovered and given proper burial. 1 child was never found. The Christmas Eve vanishing of 1945 began as a story of inexplicable loss and ended as a testament to the unbreakable bonds of family and the relentless pursuit of truth. It serves as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope can survive, love can endure, and sometimes against all odds, the lost can find their way home. But for 8-year-old Jennie Sodder, the mystery continued. Somewhere in America, an 87-year-old woman might still be living under an assumed name, unaware that a family spent decades searching for her, unaware that her mother set a place for her at every Christmas dinner until the day she died. The search for Jennie Sodder may be over, but her story remains unfinished, a final question mark in a case that revealed both the depths of human evil and the heights of human love. 5 children vanished into the night on Christmas Eve 1945, 3 came home, 1 was laid to rest, 1 remains lost forever, a ghost of Christmas past who haunts the memories of all who knew her story. And in that loss, in that enduring mystery, lies the true horror of the Christmas Eve vanishing. Not just that children were taken, but that the taking of even 1 innocent life leaves a wound in the world that can never fully heal. The Sodder family's search is over, but some questions, some mysteries, some losses are so profound that they echo through time, reminding us that evil actions have consequences that ripple across generations, and that some Christmas Eves will forever be remembered, not for joy and celebration, but for the children who were stolen from their beds and lost to the darkness of human cruelty. In memory of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie and Betty Sodder, 5 children whose disappearance revealed the truth about a conspiracy of evil, and whose story reminds us that family love can survive even the most devastating losses. The mystery is solved, the case is closed, but the memory lives on, and the search for justice never truly ends.